Amen. Well, if you take your Bibles tonight and turn to Exodus chapter 17, and you'll notice that Exodus 17 is short, and I've already mentioned to you that our time is abbreviated, but what I want to do this evening is I want to try to get us through Exodus 17 and 18. Exodus 17 is only about 16 verses. Exodus 18 is about 26 verses, so 43 verses or so overall that I've got about 25 minutes to discuss. And here's why, kind of at the last minute today, I decided to put these chapters together. I told you a couple of weeks ago that we've got 3 weeks left, 3 Wednesday evenings, and I had it planned out 17, 18, 19, then we'd come back after Christmas and we'd really get into the Ten Commandments and the giving of the law in the new year. But I'm sure that most of you are at least aware by now. You may not have been aware until today or the last couple of days about what happened at the Supreme Court today. And so what I want to do next Wednesday night is I want to take our time to discuss with you what went down at the Supreme Court today. How many of you have no idea what I'm talking about? Be honest. You have no idea what I'm talking about? Wow. Even no shame on you. That came out wrong. Sorry about that. Even more reason for us to talk about it next year. Or next week. Sorry. Next week. So yes, tell your friends, be here next week. So today was the Supreme Court oral arguments of Dobbs v. Jackson, which is the most unprecedented case to come before the Supreme Court in 3 decades that gives the possibility of overturning Roe versus Wade. It's a case that has come out of the state of Mississippi, and a women's health clinic there that has essentially argued that Mississippi's abortion laws, which are very restrictive, are unconstitutional. And so what this Supreme Court case is now giving the justices an opportunity to do is review these state statutes and essentially argue, is there now evidence for us on jurisprudence status to overturn Roe v. Wade and essentially put it in the hands of the people or in the hands of the states to make determinations about abortion access in America. To state that today's oral arguments are unprecedented is an understatement. This is a once-in-a-lifetime case. This is something that every Christian should know about and every Christian should be praying about. And so I know some of you probably were aware and were able to pray today. Oral arguments were at 10 o'clock this morning. I listened to about an hour or so of those oral arguments and tried to make sense of it as best as I could. So what I want to do next week is I want to try to set up some of the context for how this even came about. And so I'll give a little history of Roe versus Wade. I'll give a little history of Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is the other kind of big case in the right for pro-life causes in the United States. And then we'll talk specifically about Dobbs v. Jackson and what's before the Supreme Court now. And I'll even try to look at, I know in the morning, if any of you listen to Dr. Mohler's podcast, Dr. Albert Mohler's morning podcast, The Briefing, tomorrow, he's going to be doing a very brief kind of discourse on the oral arguments. As you listen to the oral arguments today, you could hear 2 things. One, you could hear how some of the justices very clearly lean pro-life, and it gives great hope for what the decision may be. And then you could hear how some of the justices are just radically and fanatically against the pro-life cause. And that came out very strongly in some of their arguments. So we'll take a look at that next week, but my fear in America and my fear among even pro-life Christians is that we believe in the sanctity of life, we believe in the Imago Dei, we believe that abortion should be abolished, we believe that it's no longer about a woman's right to choose or reproductive rights. We stand and fight against abortion at all costs. But my great feeling is that when we begin to talk about how this is actually playing out in American life and in the courts and in the culture, we don't really have any idea what we're talking about. And I think Christians should be thoughtful people. who understand exactly what was going on in Roe versus Wade and exactly what was going on in Planned Parenthood versus Casey and exactly what's going on now, so that we can speak rightly and think rightly about these things. So we'll take our whole time next week to talk specifically about these important issues for the pro-life cause and try to give some time for dialogue or for Q&A. So hopefully that will be of interest to you, and then we'll finish the following week with Exodus 19. All right, Exodus 17. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of sin by stages according to the commandment of the Lord and camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, "Choose for us men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." So Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed, and whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew weary, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. So his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." And Moses built an altar and called the name of it, "The Lord is my banner," saying, "A hand upon the throne of the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." Well, if I divided these two paragraphs up and just gave you a little simple Bible test, hey, what happened when the people grumbled about not having any water and there was a rock involved? My guess is that most of you would say, well, God told Moses to hit it, and Moses hit it, and water came out, and the people had water. Good job, you pass. The end. And then what happened when they went to war with Amalek and Moses started getting tired and he had Aaron and Hur beside him? Oh, yeah. That's the story where like he would hold his staff up, but his hands would get tired. And so Aaron was on one side and Hur was on the other, and they won the battle. Good job. Test passed. Is there more to it than that? And as you know, the answer is always yes. There's so much more to it than that. So we find ourselves in Exodus 17. All of the people, remember, they've been in the wilderness. They've been moving forward, and they've been called back to the Philistine area by the sea. And then as they move on, they didn't have any food. They grumbled, and they told God, "We don't have any food. Why have you led us out here to die?" And we pointed out 2 weeks ago, I know that seems like forever ago, but 2 weeks ago, we pointed out that they grumble against Moses. But when Moses finally kind of speaks back to them from God, Moses says, "Why are you grumbling against?" Who? The Lord. Moses made it very clear to them, you're grumbling against the Lord. Your complaints are before the Lord. And each time the Lord brings provision. Each time the Lord cares for them, gives them just what they need. And so we had the story of the quail and the story of the manna. Before that, the story of pillar of cloud and pillar of fire. God is with them. Remember way back in Exodus 3, God had promised Moses, I will be with you. Before there was ever a people that were taken out of Egypt, God had promised Moses, I'm going to be with you. Wherever you go, I'm going to be with you. I mean, we could just claim that promise of God towards Moses and know that God's going to be with the people because Moses is with the people. But this becomes an issue of the people testing God's faithfulness, of them doubting his goodness, doubting his word, doubting his provision. So we have triumph and we have provision and we have this moment of flourishing and celebration, and then right back to grumbling, chapter after chapter after chapter. And it's the same thing with Exodus 17. Just after God has given them manna, after he fed them for 40 years with manna. Now, that 40 years has not elapsed. This is a foreshadowing and a look at what God will do. 40 years has not yet passed, but as we move into Exodus 17, we know God's meeting their need every day. Remember, every day they've been told, here's how much manna you should collect for your family this day. But they get thirsty. They don't have any water. And so what do? They grumble. Now, one of the things that I didn't point out, somebody came up 2 weeks ago and asked me a question at the end of our time together, and I told them, I was like, yeah, I ran out of time to say everything I wanted to say. But one of the things that I didn't point out 2 weeks ago is that when they complained that they didn't have food, what should we have realized at that point? They did have food. They had food all around them. They had plundered the Egyptians. They had herds. They had livestock. Now, there were portions of the livestock that certainly were to be devoted to sacrifice. And there were portions of the livestock that they undoubtedly wanted to take into the new land that God had promised them so that they could plow the fields and things like that. But when you think about the kinds of things that they could have had from their herds, whether that's meat from the herds or milk from the herds or whatever, the reality that's been pointed out about that passage of Scripture is it's not that they had zero food in the camp. It's that they didn't have what they wanted. They didn't have the kind of food they wanted. They wanted something different and something else and something more, and they wanted to save what they had, and they wanted some kind of miraculous provision from the Lord, which the Lord was gracious enough to give. It's like when the kids, right, they go to the pantry and they say, we don't have anything to eat. And then you open up the pantry and, no, we actually have a whole lot to eat. And then once you get them all in bed and you get them tucked in tight, right, they've brushed their teeth, and then what happens? I'm thirsty, right? They need water. It's not just my family, right? I think it's every family is plagued by this same problem. The people grumble, they thirst. Give us water to drink. The end of verse 2, Moses again says very clearly, first, why do you quarrel with me? But then he says, and why do you test the Lord? The people thirsted there for water. They question again, why did you bring us up out of Egypt? You're going to kill us here? Kill our livestock? Kill our children? Moses cried out to the Lord, what shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me. What am I going to do here? They're grumbling again. And God says, take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go. Verse 6 is very, very important. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink. So if you picture what God is doing, they're at Horeb, they're in need of water, there is a rock that is there, and God says to Moses, I'm going to go and be on the rock in front of you. Now, we don't really know what that means. Does that mean that the pillar of cloud is going to settle, that the presence of God is going to settle? But the language of God being in front of the people, before the people, has been pointed out by some commentators to be a judicial presence. that God is taking the place of, as it were, a guilty party. He's standing in front at the rock, and when he tells Moses to strike the rock, he's essentially saying, when you strike the rock, you'll be striking me. I'm going to take the lash. I'm going to take the striking so that there may be provision and salvation for my people. And God does just as he said. Moses did so in the sight of all the elders of Israel. Water was provided. He calls the name of this place Massa, Meribah. If you have footnotes, it just means testing or quarreling. This was a place where they tested God. And notice at the very end of the paragraph, I think perhaps the most prominent question in this entire section of Exodus. It says that he called it this place because they tested the Lord by saying, is the Lord among us or not? You see, their question really wasn't, are we going to have food? Their question really wasn't, I'm thirsty, are we going to have anything to drink? Their question was, is the Lord going to do what he said he was going to do? Is the Lord really among us? Now, keep your finger there and turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. A couple of you have asked why we haven't looked at this text, and because we haven't gotten all the way through it yet. But now we're there. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul writes, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers, remember he's writing to Jews and Gentiles in Corinth, but probably mostly Gentiles. But he calls them brothers and then says that the spiritual fathers were their fathers too. Our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them. And the rock was Christ. Now, there have been different theories that have been put out, like, was there some mystical, magical rock that literally followed the people around the whole time they were in the wilderness? And this was the rock that was Horeb that Moses struck, and then it just moved with them mystically everywhere they went? I don't think that's what Moses was intending, or the Apostle Paul. I think this is a typological connection that's being made from Exodus chapter 17, when God gave them the salvation and the provision that they needed through the rock. And now in the New Testament, you have Jesus coming, and in passages like John chapter 7 and others, he says, I am the living water. He who comes to me will never thirst. When Jesus goes to the cross, he is struck with the penalty of our sin by the Father. The Father was pleased to crush him, and he brings provision and salvation to all of his people when they come through the Lord Jesus Christ. So when Paul writes to the church at Corinth, he says, hey, just listen to our story. Listen to the story of the Old Testament. Listen to all of the ways that they passed through the sea and they were under the cloud and they drank from the spiritual rock, and that rock was Christ. What was happening there was a picture of the fact that if they would have faith to believe that the Redeemer and the Messiah would come, just as God had promised, this rock that provides the provision of living water to them is the rock of the New Testament that we find true to be in Jesus. There's more that I could say about that, but we don't have time. Then we have the story of Amalek and Israel and Rephidim. So the people continue to march through the wilderness, and there's a couple million of them. They're spread out, they're weary, they're eating manna and they're eating water. We come to other passages of Scripture in the Old Testament that refer back to this passage, and it seems as if Amalek realized these folks are kind of easy to overtake because they're just languishing out there in the wilderness. And so this gives us the understanding that Amalek has given them a surprise attack. He sees the Israelites and he says, hey, I can overtake these people. And he goes out to war with them. There are two significant things about this passage that I think most people just skip right over. We've seen tumult, we've seen fighting, we've seen violence ever since Cain and Abel. But this is the first war in the Old Testament. This is the first major battle between God's people and a pagan neighboring people in the Old Testament. And it's also the first time that a really significant character is mentioned. Who's that? Joshua. We just read right over it, right? Because we know Joshua, we know the biblical name, we know there's a whole book named after him, we know he's the guy that's going to succeed Moses. But this is our introduction to Joshua. And at this point, he's just one of Moses' right-hand men, and Moses looks to him and says, hey, go out and take care of all these guys. You go fight with Amalek. Moses goes up on the mountain, goes up on the hill, and raises the staff of God. Again, notice in these paragraphs, notice in these scriptures, the staff that has been the emblem, the symbol, the very presence of God's might among the people is used once again. It's performed miracles, it's parted the sea, it just struck the rock, and now it is the staff that is held up. And as long as Moses' hands are up, the people are winning the battle. But Moses gets weary, and then they begin to be defeated. And then he gets a little second wind, and they're winning again. And so the Bible says they put a rock under him, they prop him up, and then Aaron and Hur get on either side of him, and they prop his hands up. Like, listen, friends, I have read countless stories about how this relates to teamwork and how this relates to leadership. You know, every good CEO needs a right-hand man and a left-hand man to hold up their arms when things get really difficult. Like, okay, fine. Make whatever principle of we need other people in our lives that you want to. That's not the point of the text. The point of the text is God's hands have been what have saved the people over and over and over again. And Moses is the mediator. God is working through Moses, giving his word to his people. His power is coming through the staff as it's held up. And the people are consistently pointed back to the fact that Moses is the dude. We could just press pause here and say, which is why it's even more heartbreaking that he doesn't get to enter the promised land. This is the guy that gets to see all the stuff unfold right in front of his eyes. And because of his sin later, he doesn't get to enter the promised land. The sin of which is the exact same thing repeated in Numbers chapter 20 that happens here in Exodus 17 with the striking of the rock. So it's not just the people that don't always listen to the Lord. It's sometimes his leaders too. In Exodus 18, we find the reintroduction to Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law. He hears all that God has done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. And he comes, he takes Zipporah, Moses' wife, verse 2, after he had sent her home along with her 2 sons. The name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. And the name of the other, Eleazar, for he said, the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. One thing that I read this week pointed out that it's interesting that we've just had 2 names given, Massa and Meribah, testing and quarreling, and the way the people are always grumbling with the Lord. And here we have the 2 names of the sons of Moses, and they're names that signify how God has been with him and testifying of his faithfulness to them. It's funny that we haven't heard anything from Zipporah and anything from the sons since that weird incident when she had to circumcise the son and tossed the bloody foreskin at Moses. And it was apparently at that point that Moses sent them back to Jethro and Midian. We haven't heard anything up from them since then, but now they're reunited. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness, where he was encamped at the mountain of God. And he sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons with her. And Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. And they asked each other of their welfare and went into the tent. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had come upon them in the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced for all the good that the Lord had done to Israel, and that he had delivered them out of the hand of the Egyptians. There's not really much more that I want to say about that. They're reunited. God reminds Jethro of all that's happened, and there's rejoicing. Verse 10, Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord, who's delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods, because in this affair they dealt arrogantly with the people. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. So it's not original to me. Again, it's been pointed out by astute biblical observers, but you have a battle here, and then you have Moses, the leader of the people, and you have a priest who comes out to meet them, and there is a worshipful celebration, and there is an offering, and there is a sacrifice. Does that sound familiar? What does it sound like? Melchizedek. It sounds like Abraham and the priest, king of Salem, Melchizedek, coming and an offering being brought and a sacrifice being brought. We talked just a couple of weeks ago about how God gave bread. He gave manna to the people. And I tried to trace for you these typological connections of bread throughout the Bible and the provision that God gives to his people, so that in the new covenant we have Christ being our sacrifice and having a meal with his followers and breaking bread with them, and he gives it to his church to do perpetually as a sign of the new covenant. And whenever you go to a restaurant and whenever they bring the bread out, you should give thanks for Jesus. Seriously. You'll hear me quote, I think, if I put it in the sermon, on Sunday, a quote from Charles Spurgeon where he compares the peace that we can only have through Jesus to bread always being on the table. And he basically says, you always have to have bread on the table. And for believers, like when we see bread on the table, it should be a reminder to us of how God consistently provided for his people. The end of this passage is the text where the people are coming to Moses, and they're coming with all of their problems and all of their concerns. And I'm just going to abbreviate it for us. You know the story, but Jethro looks at Moses, who's having to answer all of the problems, and says, why are you doing this by yourself? I mean, there's like tens of thousands of people here. You should have you've already mentioned that there are other elders of Israel. You should have other people helping you with this. And so what Moses does, using the wisdom of his father-in-law given by God, is he begins to set in place a new system of seeing things done among the people of God, where essentially the principle is, if things can be handled privately, handle them privately. If they can be handled among your family, handle it among the family. If it can be handled among the clan, handle it among the clan. If it can be handled among the tribe, handle it among the tribe. Like, not everything has to come to the top. Again, I think there are principles that we can derive from these passages and say, like, this is good business practice. This is good just relational sense for life. This is good for the doctrine of the church. I do think that God is putting in place a system that he's going to see repeated in the New Testament when he does install elders in the life of the church. Because when Jethro gives Moses advice in the middle of this section, verses 13 down through the end of verse 23, he says, I want you to find men of character. I want you to find men that won't take a bribe. I want you to find men that are trustworthy. I want you to find men that you can honor and that you can bring in to help you lead the people well. And it's almost, at least in a couple of the phrases, verbatim what Paul will tell Timothy. An elder should be above reproach. An elder should be trustworthy. An elder should not be eager for sordid gain. The kind of principles that God is putting in place is that he wants his people to be ordered well, but he still has Moses as the leader. He still has Moses as the mediator. He still has Moses as the redeemer. At the end of the passage, Moses listens. He did all that he said. He chooses out these able men, and they judge the people at all times. The hard cases, verse 26, are brought to Moses, but any small matter they decided themselves. And Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went away to his own country. As we open Exodus 19, we're going to find ourselves at Mount Sinai. We're going to get there in 2 weeks. Before the actual giving of the law, we're going to arrive at Mount Sinai. The first 67 chapters of the Bible cover about 2,600 years. The next 60 chapters of the Bible cover 11 months. The Bible gives significant time to what's happening at Sinai, which is why I wanted us to get there, celebrate Christmas, and then we'll come back and we'll begin to unpack all that God does in the giving of the law. All right? Well, let me stop us there. We'll take just a brief break and see if there's anybody else here for our time of budget Q&A. If you want to go ahead and take out your your copy of the budget.